And I'd like to bring into the discussion at this point Anban Pillay, who's the Deputy Director General for Health Regulation and Compliance in the South African Department of Health. So please come up here and join. Come around this side, you perhaps be more comfortable. It's already very full over there. It's going to get fuller. So welcome. Now, Anban, I'm so sorry. I haven't got my glasses on. Anban, sorry. Tell us, from your perspective, you're dealing every day in South Africa with very severe, very acute, very widespread health problems. Challenges of healthcare for large populations, diverse economic, socioeconomic resources and status. So how do you find these European reflections going on here in Lyon? Is it any use to you, or is it all a bit of a sideshow?
I think, yeah, certainly there are significant differences in the burden of disease between Europe and South Africa. We often say in South Africa that we have the curse of both worlds, the developed and developing worlds. We have a high incidence of HIV, TB, malaria, but we also have high incidence of the diseases that ravage Europe, such as diabetes, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, cardiovascular disease, cancers, etc. And so the incidence of all of these diseases place huge strains on the health systems in developing countries, particularly like South Africa. And so having to manage a health budget in that context is difficult, and to fund innovation is a huge challenge. I think this forum provides a unique opportunity in that it brings together innovation, it brings together investors, and it brings together governments and regulators to have this conversation about how you can bring interventions so that society can benefit from it, particularly from a developing country perspective. And we have a mini arrangement of this in our Medical Research Council, and so I was very interested in the way this BIOVISION is structured, in that I think it's able to leapfrog a number of areas that we potentially would want to benefit from. So we've been having some discussions about how potentially we could adopt some of the principles that BIOVISION has embraced, so that we could maybe do the same for developing countries like South Africa.
What sort of thing would you be happiest to be able to go home from here? That a conversation you've had, someone you've met, something you've learned, something you've been able to tell someone. What would you go back and tell the minister who unfortunately isn't able to be here? You're going to go back and you're going to report. So I've been 3 or 4 days in Lyon, met lots of nice people, had to answer a whole lot of damn fool questions from a guy on the stage, but apart from that, it was fine. What are you going to tell your minister actually happened here?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think the first thing that's very interesting is that the focus on prevention is something that's come to the fore. In developing countries, when you talk about prevention, it's often perceived as second-grade care. So often when you say to patients, prevention is important, and people say, well, I'm not really interested in prevention, I want curative care. And so I think the one thing to say to the minister is that something that is being adopted in Europe as well, because often it's scoffed at and said, well, why are you talking about prevention? Just give us the drug that's going to solve this problem, and rather than talking about how it is that you're going to prevent the disease. So I think that's the first important thing. The other important thing that I took away was from the presentation earlier from Remy, where the issue about differential pricing was raised, particularly from an international context. A number of companies, the multinationals particularly, grapple with this issue of trying to create access for medicines in developing countries. And clearly the affordability in a developing country is much lower than a developed country. But the moment they start offering those lower prices to developing countries, they often feel the threat of having to reduce those prices in the developed country markets. And it was useful in your presentation that you referred to differential pricing being embraced as part of that access program, so that companies need not then defend the lower prices in developing countries and say, well, why are you giving South Africa a lower price compared to Europe? Clearly because South Africa is unable to afford that higher price that the country is offering. And I think thirdly, this entire concept around BIOVISION is very useful, and we'd like to adopt a model of this certainly for South Africa.
Okay. What do you think of this guy and what he's doing? You can tell me what you think of this guy in a minute, but tell me about Greg first and what this Medicine Patents Pool is doing for you.
I think that the medicine patent pool has made an incredible contribution to access to ARVs in South Africa. We have the largest number of people on ARVs currently. And the reason we're able to do that, one of the reasons we're able to do that is through voluntary licenses. The multinational pharmaceutical industry would not have been able to produce the volume of ARVs that we're currently using. The only way that could be done was through voluntary licenses. And the voluntary licenses offers that win-win relationship between the innovator and the generic manufacturer, so that access to care could happen at an affordable price. At the same time, the innovator product is protected in that environment. And so I think the patent pool's been incredible in the work it's done. And the example that Greg talks about, I mean, AbbVie was a company that had previously indicated that they will not sign a voluntary license. But the reason they signed the voluntary license was not because of price. Actually, AbbVie's product is the cheapest product in South Africa currently. It's AbbVie didn't have the capacity at the time to produce sufficient quantities for the number of patients that actually needed treatment. And so they signed off a voluntary agreement, and we're paying a higher price from the generic manufacturers, actually. And so it's not about price only, it's also about the security of supply and the ability to produce those products.
Okay, thanks. Let's bring it just to this guy. I mean, I know you don't necessarily work together all the time, but on the other hand, Michel is a good example of the sort of informed research base looking right across the entire range of medicines. His own idea recently of setting up this institute, which tries to look more holistically at all the issues of health development and so on, I think touches in some ways on areas that go beyond the European domain. What sort of things would you like to see out of, how can we put it, the European academic intelligentsia, the research and academic community in Europe that would help your own predicament or challenges?
I think particularly some of the issues that Michel had raised around the way the regulatory approach occurs in Europe. I think the current approach of regulators is risk-averse, as you had indicated. And most regulators in developing countries actually follow the European model. And so whether it's by design or a result of the way the world is structured, our regulator would follow effectively what Europe is doing. And we have great difficulty often convincing a regulator that actually the risk is not as high in such circumstances, and maybe we can have alternative approaches around regulation of this product. But it becomes very difficult when the regulator doesn't see the other regulators doing the same thing. And so I think Europe has an opportunity to kind of lead the way, and the implications and the spin-offs for developing countries are quite significant in actually trying to do that.
I'd like, if I may also, before we close this session, to bounce off one of the things which is a constant area of discussion, and this is really the balance between the research community and the generic or off-patent industry, the questions of innovation requires funding. I mean, it's the same thing Greg and I used to discuss a lot when you were at the Generics Association in Brussels and so on. I know, Michel, you've obviously, as the guy who was running IMI for such a long time, IMI is devoted, by its very name, to the idea of innovation and so on. Is there a trade-off? How do you see the trade-off between the need to fund innovation and the need to provide the products of innovation at a cheaper price and so on for elsewhere? Is there a risk, ultimately, let me ask you first, is there a risk that too much emphasis on giving drugs away or giving them cheap and so on can harm innovation?
Well, there is certainly a risk. I think that what we should realize that, you know, we all say we need collaboration, we need partnership, this is what I said. This is not enough. You need to maintain competition, you need to maintain incentives for industry, and that's where intellectual property is key. When I start IMI, people told me you will never succeed because you will not find agreement on IP. We found agreement on IP, and I think that with the patent pool model, I mean, there is a step forward, and that's critical to have, you know, industry on our side. So I really think that indeed there are ways to combine, you know, collaboration and competition, and there is some words that have been created for that. And, you know, the problem of drug pricing, and actually this is an issue that we will address in our institute, first with economists dealing with theoretical model. Because obviously you have different aspects in the what means cheap, what means expensive. We know that, you know, innovation for industry, you know, requires huge investment. You have failure. I mean, they have good arguments to explain why these new drugs are costly. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to find a way to be probably more transparent so that we have a real model to see what's a reasonable price, including with the idea that industry must be profitable. There is no problem with that. It's just that we have to find the right trade-off and the fair balance. And my vision of that is that we should start with theoretical model.
Okay, well,
not starting with, you know, example, because then...
As soon as I heard you say a reasonable price, I thought, we're off into a 24-hour discussion here. Nobody's allowed to leave the room until we have a bar all the doors. This, of course, is where it comes down to all the time, a reasonable price, a fair price. I don't know how many times I've asked that question in meetings like this, and the answers are always interesting, but they're never able to pull all the things together. Anyway, I set Michel up with that. Greg, what do you feel about the way Michel answered that? Or how do you deal with that issue as well?
A couple of points. You know, industry has to make profit. The patents are an important part of securing innovation. We have to be able to build structures where you can have affordability built into that. There are a number of aspects. Actually, what I wanted to say was, made me think is that when I came into this industry, and that goes back to 1993, into this whole thing, it was very polarized.
He was 17 at
I was
the time,
17.
by the way.
So it was very polarized. You know, we had the generics on one side over here. We had the R&D industry over here. We had patients here and doctors here. We had regulators here and industry here. And there was all sense of mistrust and conflict. And that has substantially changed in the last 20 years. I mean, it's quite significant. And I think, to be honest, it sounds a bit like, you know, motherhood and apple pie, but the fact is, it's that trust and that cooperation and building up these various models, which I think is the way forward to try to bridge the issue of innovation and access. Because it is possible. It does work. We're doing it. Other people are doing it. We're finding different ways forward. But that is the way forward. But there has to be acceptance on various sides as well.
Okay, thanks,
Yeah.
Anban. Your view on this when people, for instance, back home say we're being beaten to death by high prices, by drug companies that just charge whatever they can get away with and so on, and we find it really hard to get cheaper versions of their drugs here, and they just toss us a few crumbs every now and then to try and keep us quiet. And you have to perhaps sometimes, because you said yourself, it is necessary to have profits. So clearly you sometimes need to deal with that type of, how should we say, assault on the industry's reputation or whatever. How do you deal with it when you're in those circumstances?
I think the huge challenge for the industry is trying to create affordable prices in developing countries at the same time, maintain its price in the developed market, and the issues around market share and leakage, etc. So I think that we need to resolve those issues, and often conversations with the industry can help to give them the reassurance around how these matters can be resolved. But I also wanted to say that I think that what's missing often is a conversation between those in developing countries and the innovators about what are the needs of developing countries and what are the solutions we're looking for. And then secondly, about what is it that we as developing countries could put into that mix to finance and support the development of those innovations, rather than us simply sitting back and saying the industry should innovate and bring to us what you're innovating and we'll see whether we can pay for it, and if it's unaffordable, say, well, that's not acceptable. But rather to say, well, how can we all come together? This is what our needs are, this is what we can put into the game, and this is how we can all come up with a product that we think can be affordable and will actually make a huge change to public health.
Okay, well, thank you very much.